Hi, as I was editing the lecture video from yesterday, I noticed that I may have forgot to hit record for the first 2 minutes or so of class. So I want to briefly go over some things you may want to know before class begins. First, if you have not done so, please fill out the attendance form you see on screen here. Even if you did not attend live lecture yesterday, please fill it out, just so we know who was watching lecture videos at home as well. Next, if you have not done so, please join our Slack. The slides are always linked on Slack as well as the recording for this lecture video. This will be week 1, HTML and CSS. We have 5 total lessons, you can see them here, and 2 project days. Remember, if you finish the project within that last 3 weeks of class, you can earn a College of Engineering certification. We'll go over all that towards the end of class and the end of lessons in a little bit. Thank you for watching the lecture video, and here's where the video begins. Cool. Okay, should be recording now. These weekly learning sessions will occur again at 3:30, and I'll record them and post them to YouTube most likely tonight or tomorrow morning. It may take a couple hours to edit them, so don't sweat it too much. If you still need some more help, we have open review hours every Thursday from 6 p.m. to 7 p.m. The link will be posted again in the Slack channel, but it's the same link every single time. Come and go as you please. You know, it's kind of drop in, drop out. So if you need some help, like 5 minutes or an hour, stay as long as you need. And then of course our Slack channels. So we have a couple Slack channels you can use, and people will be monitoring them every single day. So if you do need some extra help, you are perfectly fine to come in, just ask a question, and please ask it on Slack as well, so other people can get help if they have the same question. Don't email people with questions. If you could, put them on Slack, because oftentimes the questions you may have are questions other people have as well. And so asking them helps everyone learn together. So before we begin, I believe I linked it in my email to you guys yesterday, I think it is. Please have a text editor open and ready. If you do not have it, I personally love to use VS Code or Visual Studio Code. I have a link to it here if you want to download that. But really, any text editor works. I know people love Atom, they love Notepad++. If you want to use like a Vim or command line one, I stay okay, as long as you have a good way to edit code files. As a word of caution, something like Microsoft Office is not a text editor that will mess up your code formatting, and it really will not work the way you want it to work. And second, if you were with us last semester, it might seem familiar to you, but all of our demo code and our example files will be on GitHub. Again, I have that linked here. And in this GitHub, actually, let me open it up for everyone so we can see what's in it. Oh. So if you open up this GitHub, here we'll just open this up in a new tab. It's going to have all the demos labeled in these appropriate files. And as we add more lessons and we go through some more examples, if you're familiar with GitHub, the branching functionality, I will make a new branch for each lesson. I kind of talk about that a little bit in week 2, though there are actual more branches. And again, if you have any questions, let me know. I am more than happy to answer them. You can put them in chat, ask them in your breakout rooms with everyone else when we get to that. Or you can just, again, put them on Slack as well, and I'll also be monitoring that throughout the entire presentation. All right, let's get started if there are no more questions. Part 1, HTML. So what is HTML? HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language, and functionally it uses the idea of tags to represent an element on a website. Each tag uses its opening angle brackets and a closing angle brackets. I kind of have an example of how it looks right there on screen. And that's kind of how the web works. The web is literally laid out using these HTML tags, where people will describe the layout and the functionality of their site using HTML and then style it with CSS, which we'll learn a bit later today. For a long time, HTML was the only way to do things. And for a long time, it was the only way to make your site, period. But now with the advent of new technologies and new programming languages, we've made it easy, there have been easier ways to make it that don't involve strictly using HTML. But every website at the fundamental core still uses HTML. What your browser uses, what every developer uses. So we'll go through the basics to help you understand if you're not familiar with it already. So HTML describes layouts, like I kind of mentioned earlier. You can use the different tags and different groups of tags to define layouts, styles, location, and content of different parts of your websites. And then you can also use some CSS, which we'll learn later on today, to add like stylings like font, color, border, margins, padding, you name it, again, to your website. And you can also add a JavaScript, which we'll learn in week 2, and then the rest of the semester after that, to add more user functionality. Because by default, HTML is pretty static. It kind of, once it's there, it's kind of there. You can't really change it a whole lot. But using JavaScript, you can change it to make it a bit more interactive, a bit more user-friendly. So here's some basic HTML syntax. So as you can see, I have a very basic skeleton of what an HTML file might look like. So if you open up any web page, you'll see something looking like this on there. The very first line, I have it labeled line 1 here, is a doc type HTML. That just defines the start of an HTML file. It doesn't really tell the browser anything more than what it's receiving is valid HTML code, and it should render that HTML code to the web browser's viewing page. Next, I have the second line here, which begins HTML. And again, look how I have the opening tag idea in angle brackets. So the angle brackets is the idea of a tag, and the word in between the angle brackets is going to be like the type of element you want to create. HTML defines the beginning of the HTML code. And so all of your HTML code has to go in between those two opening tags, kind of like the parent tag, if you want to call it that. And of course, there's an ending one here on line 7 with a slash again in front of it, representing that it's the end of the tag. I also have this green bar here to kind of show you this all belongs to a single tag, because tags can be nested upon each other. And so it can be kind of confusing to figure out which tag parent group a tag belongs to. So I kind of color code these tags to make them easier to see. Now you can see here on lines 3 and 4 are the head tag and the closing head tag. That's more for your browser than for you. It's going to stuff like how big your window is, what the title of your page is, what icon to use, what kind of other files to load. You don't have to worry about that section. We'll always give you stuff that has to go inside of that section there. Don't worry about it. There only is one thing you have to know. We'll cover a bit later. The important thing you should know is the body tag, which is below the head. Head, body, kind of like a person almost. And so the body tag represents layouts. And so we use the body tag to actually represent all of our code we want to write for the HTML design. And then again, the closing HTML tag, like I mentioned earlier. So there are some basic ideas of what you could put inside of a body tag. So again, these all are going to be used to actually represent different layouts of a website. We'll go over 6 tags right now. We'll kind of practice them really first quick. So the first tag is a div tag, D-I-V. Div is kind of like an invisible group that holds other tags. And it kind of sounds pretty useless, but really it's kind of powerful in the fact that you can have, for example, like your navigation bar and your footer bar both be a div tag. And so you can move that div tag and all the elements inside, like the navigation links or your copyright, whatever, and move it around on the page or format on your page however you like it. And that really makes it easy to group things together to kind of have like a logical system for how things should look in your HTML code and how they should render properly to the actual end user. We'll use divs a lot in VueJS as you need divs to kind of act as like a big parent grouping tag. And so remember, divs are just invisible groups. You can make them colored in or kind of have a style, but by default they are empty. They have no color, no texture, nothing like that. The next big tag you should be aware of is the H tag. The H and then the little number sign there, you can put a number between 1 and 6. So H1, H2, H5, H6, something like that, or H4, H3, I guess. And that is going to give you like your big heading text. So H1 is the biggest, H6 is the smallest. So as you get larger in number, the text can get smaller, like different subheadings. So for example, H1 might be like your page title, H2 might be your section header or like your subsection header, and you keep getting smaller for as many as you have section-wise. You definitely will be using a lot of H tags because again, they help make a site look formal, look good, look like presentable. The final tag that we're going to really cover briefly is the P tag. So P stands for paragraph, and it's just paragraph text. So you could put a block of text, a sentence, a word, it does not matter. As long as the whole thing is surrounded by P tags, it'll format like a paragraph. And so a lot of sites use paragraph tags to make have cohesive paragraphs like you might imagine in your HTML code. Are there any questions so far? You can put questions in the Zoom chat and you put it up here quick. or you can put them on Slack. I'll get to them as I see them through there as well. All right, I don't see any at the moment, but if you have some, put them in there, and me or one of the mentors will be more than happy to help you out with that. What is the difference between head and H? Yeah, it's a good question, actually. So again, head is stuff that your browser will care about. Again, stuff like your size of your screen, it's like the other files to load in, the title of your web page. Nothing that happens in the head tag, which is, let me pull it up here, oh, wrong web, is here, will be rendered to the browser. It's all telling the computer how to help the page be rendered properly. In comparison, the H number, for example, remember, the number is replaced with an actual like number. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6. That represents like an actual like a title, like a section heading or something similar. Thank you, AJ. Yeah. So you can choose a different heading number or heading size depending upon how much emphasis you want to put on that text. So for example, it's very common to use H1 for like the big top header, like what the name of your site is, H2 for like a section header, or then you can keep going smaller and smaller as your page has different subsections to it. What is the purpose of a div tag? Yeah, so div tags don't seem very useful right now because they do have very bizarre properties, but trust me, you will use them all the time starting week 3 because a lot of the code you're going to write involves putting things in groups. And since div tags act as like invisible groupings of other tags, we can use div tags to make logical clusters of elements that are kind of the same functionality. So we can style it together, we can edit them together, we can generate them together using Vue or even CSS. Yeah, cool. I'm glad I could help everyone out. Again, if any questions, please put them in the chat. Someone will be happy to answer them. Cool. Oh, excuse me. Some biology today. So the last 3 important tags you're going to probably want to know are the UL, OL, and LI tags. So these are just lists, essentially. The L stands for list here. So UL stands for bullet point list. OL stands for numbered list or ordered list. And LI stands for list item. The UL stands for unordered list, in case you were wondering there. And the way you would have these work is you would put the UL or the OL tags inside of your body tag, like you would any other tag. And for each item or each bullet point, each number you want to represent in your list, you would make each one a separate LI or list item. Don't worry, we'll go over an example, but basically it looked like UL, LI, 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 and then a closing UL tag. So we use the LI tags to kind of give where the breaks in where the list item breaks should be. Because otherwise, if you give it like a list of like a nice bullet point list that you wrote, the computer can't tell like how to format that properly. So we use UL or LI tags to tell it, okay, this is a logical item. It can be a paragraph, it can be a sentence, it can be a picture even. And this should be bullet pointed and put in a list with these other items here. Are these case sensitive? Yes, please make sure you keep everything lowercase spelled exactly as you see. While some browsers may load it properly if they are uppercase or different case style you use, other browsers will fail. It's kind of very much mismatch. The standard says lowercase, so we only teach lowercase. All right, so here is a quick demo of all the 6 tags, because in case you aren't familiar with HTML, it can kind of seem like a lot. So we pull up the proper one. So this demo 1, the HTML, is on the GitHub if you want to follow along or even copy it or modify it or what have you. And it's going to be pretty simple. It's literally just a basic HTML file. You have a little comment here. So let's walk through it line by line. This first line here is the doc type HTML. Like I said, that just tells, oh, sorry, I can zoom in, yeah. How do I zoom in? It's a great question. One second, I have to figure out how to zoom in here, sorry. File. Try this. Oh, there it is, cool. Okay, is that big enough, guys? Or should we make it bigger? Okay, it's big, cool, perfect. It's good, thank you. I'm sorry, I had to fix my screen here. All right. So doc type HTML. Doc type HTML again just tells the computer that the file it's about to open is this regular old HTML. There aren't really many other doc types. I'm not sure why it's always there, but you definitely should include it because again, some browsers don't load it properly without the doc type. So always include that. And again, this doc type does not have to be uppercase. By tradition, by standard, it is, but that is the one tag where you can make it upper or lower, and every browser should treat it the exact same. So here's our opening HTML tag. And what I love about VS Code or any other text editor is actually if you can kind of see here on the left, it'll have these little white or gray lines that kind of show you the tags like opening and closing. And so what you can do is really keep track of where you are in your tag structure by following these little white or gray lines. And also if you click somewhere deep, like this random line here, I look at the very top of my little window, it'll actually show you the actual where you are layout wise as well. So you could use either the number of lines here or even like the top bar here to figure out exactly what tag you're in. You could like jump back if you want to like a different tag and like open them up and see the other tag inside of them. Really easy to kind of see exactly where you are, where you're headed, and like where you need to be, sort of, I guess. All right, again, head. Head, again, we will tell you what has to go in there. And right now, nothing has to go in there. We will probably put some stuff in there in the CSS stuff and in the JavaScript side, but we will give you those lines that you have to copy always, because it can be kind of confusing to remember, and there are quite a few things we can't put. So here's the body. Here's the opening body, and here's the close body. And again, everything in between the open and the close is what's rendered to the page, especially the body tag. So line 7 is an HTML comment. You won't see me use too many of these, but in case they happen, they are here. HTML comments are literally just going to be a way to describe what's happening in your code. Like normal comments in other normal programming languages, they're completely optional, or they're not, up to you and your people you're coding with. But I highly recommend if you're doing some kind of fancy stuff, you have a lot of nested tags, you please use comments to help people figure out what your code's supposed to be doing. H1. So again, the H number sign is just the heading size, I guess. The bigger, the smaller, which is kind of counterintuitive there, but here we are. H1, it is like a big title text, and it says that this is demo 1, meaning on the very top of my screen, it will show this is demo 1 in very big font. Then I have this div tag. And again, remember, divs are just invisible groupings. So you won't see the div tag, but you will see the elements inside of the div tag. That makes any sense whatsoever. And you'll see why we care about this and about demo 3 when you cover some CSS. So here are the p tags I mentioned. It is a p and then some text. And like I said, the amount of text you put in the p tags is totally up to you. It does not matter. So you guys can put like a sentence, a whole 2-3 paragraphs. You can put a whole novel if you wanted to. And what the p tag will do is just, add line breaks, make it look nice, format it, wrap the lines like you would expect it to do in like a Word document, for example. So we have 2 p tags, so we should see 2 separate paragraphs of kind of 2 different lines with this little bit of text here. And then here are those lists I was telling you about. So like I said, remember, the way lists work is it's the type of list, opening and closing, and in between the type of list, it should have list items or LI tags, where each LI is just the logical grouping of text or other tags even you want to put inside that one bullet pointer numbering system. So LI here, we have some bullet points for the UL, which stands for unordered list, and OL for ordered list. So we have some number 1, number 2. And if in case you aren't sure what a tag does, in VS Code specifically, if you hover over in VS Code, it will actually kind of give you a little pop-up telling you where it is, like what the actual item is, the actual official reference standard says. So if you ever forget, just hover over it, it'll tell you, and you can click on the link there to open it up in your web browser. So how do we view these files? Great question. If we open up our little file explorer and navigate to the folder where we saved the code, and in my case, I saved mine on my user folder, so we're just gonna dig through my hard drive really quick. Oh, here. And you'll see the files that you kind of see here as well. Most computers should be able to do this natively. We should be able to just double click on the HTML file. So in my case, demo1.html. And it may ask you where you want to open it. I want to open it up in Firefox, which is the browser that I use, but you can use whatever browser you prefer the best. And you'll see that it renders the code on your screen just like any normal web page. So as you can see, the big demo1 text, that big H1 tag. We have these two paragraph looking lines here. We have the bullet points, we have the ordered lists. So here we kind of have an example of all of the 6 tags we've learned and how we could use them all in our code. Are there any questions so far? Yes. Type outside of paragraph block and display like a paragraph. Why use P? That's a great question. So the question, in case you didn't see it, was if I put text, say, if we open my text editor again. Oh, that's the wrong one. This one. If I put text, say, here. Text, text, text. Oh. And I save my file and we refresh the page. It still shows up like here. So why do we care about that? That's a great question. So back in the old days of say the mid 90s, early 2000s, there wasn't a way to display text other than in P tags. So P tags were kind of part of the OG standard way back in 93, 92. And it kind of kept in the entire standard until now. And so while you can still use P tags, it's oftentimes very common to not use P tags because the problem people have with P tags is they do love the formatting for you. Some people don't love the line breaks they add or even the formatting they adds, which you'll know about with the CSS. And so people nowadays tend to sometimes use P tags, but more likely use something called the div tags and just put text in div tags because divs are much more easy to style and much more user-friendly when you're kind of making your own kind of looking layout. So yeah, P tags are more of like a holdover from the old days, but you still see them in actual code nowadays. And then yes, when our mentor, you have put a great comment here. If you are using VS Code, you can use an extension. I've never used it, but I've heard good things about it called Browser Preview. That should allow you to actually see the results of your HTML code right there in your screen. So you won't have to actually open up a web browser. But if you don't have VS Code or an equivalent extension, or you don't want to install that extension, you can just kind of open it up with the File Explorer method, click on the file here, and your web browser will load it just fine, like I showed you guys. Make sure you move this over a little bit so I can click on my button. All right, cool. Are there any other questions about demo program 1? We'll wait a few minutes, just hope anyone catches up. All right, I'm not seeing any, but like I said, if you do have any questions, please try them out. And if you want to practice a little bit, I recommend you take the demo file, open it up on your computer, kind of play around with it, edit some stuff, remove it, add it, see what happens. And your browser is amazing because HTML is very resilient. So even if you screw something up, your computer will fix it somehow. Where do we find browser preview and Visual Studio Code? Great question, actually. Let me show it really quick. Here we go. So if you're on VS Code and you want to install a extension, you can go on the left-hand bar, scroll down to the extensions, which is this little 4 blocks here in the corner, and you can search for it right there. So I have some installed that I use, but if you look up browser preview, you guys can see the top one here is browser preview, and you can also install live server as I mentioned again, live server. And so you can use these to actually look at the code if you don't want to open it up in a browser like I do. So it gets a little 4 box here, the little 4 boxes called extensions, and search for it in this little search box on top. All right, cool. Now, some other brief HTML stuff. Now, we covered the basics of HTML, but there are a lot of cool features in HTML we're not going to go over in this class, but there are 4 more you should know because you'll probably use them quite a bit in your code. The 4 more, along with the 6 we covered 5 minutes ago, are IMG, button, BR, and A. Does anyone want to guess what IMG tag does? I have it there, but it's an image tag. I guess why am I asking that question? It's already there on my screen. An IMG tag you guys can use to actually show an image to the screen. It can load it from a website like a URL and it'll display it. You can change the size, you can change like the hover text and stuff like that. We'll go over all of that in the example. And the next one is a button, which just adds a button, as you guys can imagine. And any text you put in between the opening and closing part of this little button tags will actually show up in the button. Excuse me. Sorry, allergies are really bad today. Next is the BR tag. So BR stands for break, and it adds a line break to your code. The reason you want to use a BR tag is because by default, HTML in every web browser will collapse white space, like spaces, enters, tabs, what have you, into a single space. So even if you add multiple lines in between, it's going to collapse all of that into a single space. So we can use a BR, or a line break to actually add a line break wherever we want it. Dustin asks, wasn't there already a line break in between the paragraphs in demo 1? Yes, there was. And so one of the things that the P tag does is add a line break for you. But like I was mentioning a little bit earlier, sometimes you don't want to use P tags, which is sometimes like a div tag. And divs don't add any kind of line breaking. So if you need to have some line breaks, you can use the BR tag to manually force a line break. If you're using only Ps, you probably will not have to use BR tags. But if you want to make like your own text elements using, like, for example, divs, you will probably need to use a line break or BR at some point. One more little cool thing about BR tags as well is you can put them basically anywhere. So what I oftentimes use BRs for is not even line breaking text, but it's adding horizontal, like vertical space in between tags, because it'll add a set line. It's like a blank line in your code, in your web browser, no matter where it's located. So normally we use it for text, but you can also just use it for, like, for example, want to make a button space on nicer. So you can make a button A and then some space in button 2. And to make that space, you can use a BR or line break tag. So while you may not always, it stands for line break, the text line break, you do not have to use it only for text line breaks. All right, the next, or the last more commonly used element you're going to see is the A tag. So A, I'm not sure why it's called anchor tag. I don't know why they called it that. I'm sure there's a very good reason for it. But really, A stands for it's more of a link to another website or page on your site. So you guys can give it like the name of a URL, and when you click on it, like a normal link, it'll go to that URL. And again, the text you put in between the A tags is how the text will appear on screen for the link. So you could have like the link say maybe, I don't know, Google, and then it goes to google.com when you click on it. Any questions so far with these 4 tags? These are a bit more special because they have some advanced properties we have to set before we could use them. But I want to make sure everyone understands that these, how these kind of like would work in a real code. All right, I don't see any at the moment. That's perfect. Actually, yeah, we'll go over this one out too. Yeah. So the head tag. This is the last kind of big HTML thing we're going to cover today. The head tag is, like I said, it's stuff for your browser. Nothing that happens in the head tag will actually appear on screen. It might change what you see on screen, but it won't actually make it, like it won't actually render it anything to the actual screen. Excuse me. We will give you most of the time any of the code you need to make your head tags like work properly. You don't have to put anything, but there are a few tags you should include for this because it looks nicer. The only 2 tags you have to know, and these are really important, are the title and link tags. So the title tag makes the title of your website. So for example, if I quickly stop presenting here, the title of this tab is, lesson 1 HTML CSS, and this one is the software Saturdays GitHub. That title is set, the browser tab title is set using the title tag inside of the head section of the HTML file. And link will be used to link, as the name suggests, CSS and other files into HTML code. So we'll go over that a little bit later towards the CSS section of things, but just know that it exists. Are there any questions? Because that can be confusing if you're not familiar with HTML before. Watch my chat here. All right, I'm not seeing any, but we will be heading into smaller breakout rooms with our mentors in a little bit, so you guys can ask any questions you have there if you don't want to ask them publicly in this whole big chat here. All right, demo program 2. Excuse me 1 second. Sorry about that again. Demo2.html. So get this on the GitHub if you want to follow along there. So I'm not going to walk through all of it because a lot of it is text mostly, but the basics. So again, doc type, HTML, bodies, you got some p tags, you know, the closing tag on the bottom here. But here are the fun tags. So the head, if you look at the head of the demo 1, it was blank. But here we've added this title. And so again, the title tag, what it does is the browser tab title will be set to lesson 1 demo 2. So you can actually tell what your site looking at from the browser tab alone. All right, that's the first interesting new tag. So we have H1, here's an H3 tag actually. So again, it'd be some smaller, like a section, like a subsection heading text if you want to think of it that. First one is this IMG tag. So again, IMG we use to link images into your code. And so the reason I kind of cover these afterwards is they have what's called properties to them. Properties are HTML elements that are HTML elements that are HTML directives. We tell the elements to make them format or look differently. And so the way you kind of give properties is inside of the tag. So you can see here, here's the open, if I don't highlight it properly, here's the opening like little angle bracket, and here is like the closing angle bracket. And the HTML properties for the element is a space list inside of that tag. And the space list will be like the name of the property, an equal sign, and then in quotes, the value. Space, repeat, space, repeat. And so keep that in mind. You will have to know that for CSS, JavaScript, Vue, HTML, it's like everything. So not every tag has HTML properties, only a few do, but we'll cover the few that do need them right now and a little bit next week as well. So the IMG or image tag has 3 main HTML properties you have to set. The first one is SRC, then there's ALT, and then there's title. So SRC, if you've ever taken a programming course before, you are probably familiar that SRC stands for source, and it's the location to where the image you want to load comes from. So in this example, SRC points to demo2.svg, which the fella have, it's the pretty logo. You can't see it properly, but it's just a pretty logo, and it'll load the image from that location. So if you're pointing to a picture on your site, so on your little website, you can just say the name of it that way, like demo2.svg. But if you were to point to an external website, for example, like Wikipedia or like Google Images, you would have to put the entire URL, including the HTTPS : name of the URL, blah, 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 blah. If you don't, it'll probably break and won't load properly. So remember, if you're going to load from your own site, just the file name is okay. But if you want to load from a different website, you have to put the entire URL, including HTTPS : ALT stands for alt, and don't worry about alt too much. It's there for 2 purposes. One, in case the user who's loading a website has a slow internet connection, the page can display the alt instead of the image, kind of like as a filler placeholder image of sorts. And also very important too, actually the more important reason, is a lot of screen readers or ways to help people who can't see well read web pages use the alt property to describe the image to the user. So make sure you always have a good alt image or a good alt description to help people who are blind or hard of seeing properly see your web page. Is there an argument to resize? Yes, there is actually. I was going to cover that a little bit later, a little bit ahead of you there. But yeah, you can totally resize it. We'll cover that in the CSS part of the lecture today. Last thing is title. So title is just what happens or what you will see if you hover over the code, or not the code, the image, my bad. So like hover text essentially. You can make whatever you want, but make it descriptive, what I would recommend. So for example, this one here is a Purdue logo. All right, that's the image tag. Again, the three properties you have to include are src, alt, and title. Again, src is where you load the image from. Alt is what the image, like a description of the image for people who are blind or hard of seeing, or just even have a slow internet connection. And well, title is like the hover text for the image. Okay, the next tag we're going to look at here is the A tag, because I have the B tag somewhere down there. So again, here is the A tag. Again, you have the opening tag and then the closing little A right there. And remember, the text that appears in between the opening A and the closing A is the link text. So what will happen is you'll see like a blue hyperlink that says link. And when you click on it, it'll take you to the actual website. And so in the to tell the web page what link to take you to, you can use the href. I'm not 100% sure what href stands for, so I can't really ask that question, but just know that it points to the location of the link you want to go to. So again, like an HTML property, it's href equals, and then in quotes, the name of the link. So here I have it going to https://purdue.edu. Sorry. But again, as a reminder, if you're linking to a page on your own site, all you have to do is put the name of the page. So for example, if I wanted to take you to demo one, I could just say demo1.html. I don't have to put this whole HTTPS in front of it. HTTPS is only if you want to take them to a site that's not on your own web page, your own website. Then the last tag we covered was the button, or second last tag is the button tag. So as you can see here, there's a button, close button, it says click me. Right now, the button won't do anything. We'll cover how to actually make your buttons do stuff next week with JavaScript. But right now, know that you can make a nice formatted button, and that the button will eventually can be used to trigger events or other JavaScript code to run when you click on it. That's next week's problem. And then the last tag is this BR tag. So as you can see, and here's an example of why you would use a BR tag. I have a single P tag on this whole thing, meaning that there will be a space after it, but not inside this block of text. And so if I wanted to format the block of text inside of the P tag, the only way to do that is to put BR or line breaks. And so I have a BR here, and it's very important to look at this. HTML will combine any white space into a single space, like I mentioned. So you can have 1, 25, 35, a whole page of spaces. But to HTML, that's only a single space. And so if you want to add like a line break, like make your paragraphs more paragraphy, you have to use a BR or line break. Cool. Let's open up demo 2. All right. So here's our image. You can see this is the Purdue logo. Here's the button that does nothing. So as you can see, nothing much happens to it. And here's a link to Purdue's homepage. So again, it's a blue hyperlink everyone's kind of familiar with. If I click on it, if I control open a new tab, it takes me to Purdue's homepage. So that's how you can actually use link tags to point to other pages. And then finally, this block of text here. You can't see the line break very well because it's very minor, but you can somewhat see it. After this giant block of text, the lorem ipsum should technically be after it. But because we have the line break, which let me show you again, is right there, the lorem ipsum actually comes on the next line. You can actually add multiple line breaks in a row. So if I put this second BR tag, and a third BR tag, it will respect that, and if I reload the page, it'll add this nice big space underneath in between my paragraphs I want to make. All right, and as one final aside, You may notice that some tags, for example, the IMG and the BR tag, don't have a closing. They kind of just have the IMG slash and then the closing bracket. There's no closing IMG tag. Well, in the HTML5 specification, there's actually a way that if your tag will take cannot have anything in between it, like you just the tag itself, like for example, breaks don't have, you can't put text in their break, it makes no sense. You can actually just self-close the tag. And self-closing is again going BR space, or not even space, you don't have to have a space there. BR and then the closing sign. And that would mean that this tag exists by itself and does not need anything else. The closing part though is optional, and your browser, like I said, will render the code perfectly fine. So if you don't want to add this little slash here, no problem, your browser will work. But I recommend for readability purposes, putting a little closing slash and having space there to make it look nicer. But again, that is totally optional. Are there any quick questions before we move on? When I look at the HTML, the alt text appears instead of the Purdue logo. Yeah, so what that means is actually a great example of why we need the alt text. That means that the code cannot find the image demo2.svg. So make sure that when you're copying my code, you actually download the SVG file that's in the GitHub as well and put it next to your code. Otherwise, it will not load the image and just create the alt text because it's like it can't find it, so give me the placeholder. Also, why you need to have alt text in case you can't load an image. All right. So this make sure you have both of them together. Yeah, I would try to group my programs by file name. So the demo number, every file with the name demo number kind of goes together. So kind of get them in pairs if you have to. All right, now it is time to, okay, last little bit here. We only went over the basics of HTML. There's other stuff like videos, formatting, frames, you name it. If you are interested in learning more, I have a link here to a very good resource, wtschools.com/html. I recommend you check it out for more help if you need it, or even just to learn if you want to as well. All right, it is time for checkpoint number 1. So a lot of you may already actually be kind of working on checkpoint 1 by accident here, but checkpoint 1 is just to try and make a basic website. So we'll put you guys in breakout rooms so you can work together if you need to, even ask questions to a mentor more one-on-one, more verbally if you're kind of like that style better, but make a web page. Try to incorporate all 6 tags together, and if you want to feel fancy, try putting tags within tags. What happens if you put like a link? If you put an image in a link in a UL? Like what happens? Try it. You never know. And so I'm gonna start. All right, here we go. And while we're done with participants, us not in the way. Okay. Perfect. So I hope everyone was able to kind of learn a little or practice a little bit, figure out what they needed to figure out. It is time for the second half we're going to cover, which is CSS. And so this will be shouldn't be too bad. It's basically going to be taking the HTML we worked on like 2 minutes ago, 5 minutes ago, and making them look nicer. Because plain HTML looks pretty boring if you've noticed. It's not very fun. So we're going to try practicing some CSS, which will make our websites look more modern, more user-friendly, you might want to say. All right. There we go. Okay, so what is CSS? So CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets, and it describes how to style HTML tags. Because like I mentioned, if you've kind of noticed, plain HTML tags look pretty boring. Here we go. And it makes formatting really simple and really easy to read. So you can read a CSS file and know exactly what it's doing with very little training. And so CSS consists of groupings of similar HTML tags that are all going to be styled the same. And each group is given styling instructions, which kind of sounds confusing, but we'll go into what the groupings mean in about a few minutes. So CSS has 3 kinds of groups, they're kind of called. A tag group consists of every HTML element by that tag name or that opening tag name. Class elements are multiple different HTML elements that have the same class, and ID groups, or more like an ID kind of CSS grouping, are a single HTML element. And the cool thing is HTML elements can belong to multiple CSS groups. So you could have one that just handles tags, one that handles classes and IDs, and maybe have a tag that fits in all three categories. It's actually very common to do something like that. And you will definitely need to probably have multiple groupings that involve multiple tags all the time in your code. So how do we really use CSS? For the first thing first, you have to use a link, the link tag we mentioned earlier. So you use a link tag to add a CSS file to your HTML file. And we'll go over how to do it, but again, like the HTML properties, you need to include an rel and an href. If you remember from the anchor or a or link or that hyperlink tag we talked about earlier, href stands for like where you want to load to or load next. And here's more like where are we loading from. And rel is like what are we loading in. So it's CSS, for example. Don't worry, we'll go over how to use it in my demo program. So some quick syntax here. The way you do CSS is the name of the group you want to style in opening curly brace, not a bracket, more like a brace, like if it's C or Java, or even JavaScript, if you're familiar with that. All of your styling instructions, and then a closing curly brace or curly bracket. Again, very similar to C or Java, or similar language if you're familiar with those. So here's an example of how you would how to write the syntax. So the tag group is just going to be name. Please be very careful here. I have the name written down in a different format. This bracket name style you see here is not how you should write your code. I just use the name as a placeholder, and very common to use a placeholder, using the brackets as a placeholder. Do not put the brackets in your code. Very common mistake. Your code will not work if you put the brackets in there. So the tag group is just going to be the name of the HTML tag. So replace this with, for example, div or h1 or even HTML, one with the whole page looks a certain way. And then again, you have the opening curly brace, your style statements, then your closing curly brace. Oh, sorry. Then the class group. So if you a dot, and then again, not the HTML name here, but the name of the class you're trying to create, opening curly brace, whatever statements are, and then closing curly brace. And an ID group will be a number sign, the name of the ID, opening, closing, dot, dot, dot. You know, same with the last other three. So again, the important thing I want to take away from this is if you want to do a tag group, there's nothing, just the name of the tag. A class group is dot class name, and then the ID group will be a hashtag and then the ID name. So we'll go over all three in our demo program, but just keep the syntax in mind. So here are some basic style options. You'll probably use these the most, but there are plenty other ones if you do need to make your code or your page look nicer. There's color, background color, font size, font family, and text align. So color is the color of the text, as the name might suggest. It's the font color, more or less. Background color is the color of the background. Font size is the size of the fonts. Font family, that's going to be what kind of font you choose to render your text as. And text align is like alignment, so left, right, center, justified, stuff like that. It's important to note two things there. Font family can take a list of fonts, and the font size does fonts, not in terms of like point fonts, but in terms of pixels or relative size. And so we'll go over that in demo, but a brief overview is that HTML is like a visual, like computer-based rendering thing. It does not use point fonts, like 12-point or 10-point fonts. That's because point fonts are more used in like printing. We're actually printing out the paper like to give to someone else. And on a computer screen, it's not a very good analogy there. So you will use what's called a px or a percent sign, or the other ones too, but those are the main two. Px is how many pixels large you want your font. So for example, I want my font size to be 20px, 20 pixels large. Or I want my font to be 15% of the web page, to be huge. Sorry. And font family will be a list of fonts. This is because not every computer or every browser has every font installed. And so sometimes you need to give it like a list of possible fonts in order of most to least important. It'll try to load them in order. And if it loads one, it'll great. If not, next font. And this is only used in case, for example, I want to say have my page be in Times New Roman, but the computer you're using doesn't have it installed. So how do you load it? Well, it loads the backup font, which are going to probably be, for example, a serif font. I will go over again all of that in the demo program, but as a brief overview to continue about that idea. So demo program time. Pull up my code. All right, demo 3 CSS and demo 3 HTML. We'll quickly go through the HTML file. It's not super interesting, to be honest with you. We have a title, and here's that link tag I was talking about. Link, the rel and the href properties. Rel, again, is what kind of file we're loading in. We're going to style sheet, right, to style our code. And href is where we're loading it from. And we're loading it from the file demo3.css. And again, if you're loading it from your own web page or website, you do not need anything but the file name, or the path name is a technical term. But if you're loading it from like an external source, for example, like want to use a Google CSS sheets, you have to use the https:// and the entire URL to load the CSS from that server somewhere else. So we have some h1, a couple of divs going on, and then I want to look at one thing here: this class idea, this IDs. This is obviously probably one of the more confusing parts of HTML and CSS, and it's extremely important because you will use this a lot for your JavaScript, for your final project, even in VueJS all the time. So I'll try to go through it as succinctly as possible. So classes are basically a group of tags that can repeat multiple times. So for example, I have this class example, and this div tag down here on line 20 also has the class example as well. And so classes can be multiple, you can have multiple tags that have a class, the same class name. In comparison, ID has to be unique. So for example, if you see this 15 ID examples ID here, the ID name, ID example, has to be unique, meaning on this HTML page, there cannot be any other element, the ID of ID example. Now here's some common questions. Can I have an ID and a class? Yes. Oftentimes you actually will have both an ID name and a class name. So just for example here, I would say ID and example, and I would say class, I don't know, class 2, for example. I'm gonna do that real quick. Second, do my IDs have to be unique across my entire website? No, only across a single HTML page. So if I had a page called demo 4, for example, I could in that page also use ID example if I wanted to, because it is a different HTML file. IDs are local to their HTML file in which they're written in. All right, so is that a good explanation, guys? Does that make any sense about class versus IDs? I do know that can be confusing again, and it probably will trip you up a couple times when you're first using it. All right, cool. Now on to the CSS file. So again, remember the site, demo3.html. Time to look at demo3.css. So I've used all 3 of the groupings here to kind of show you how it would make them work. So again, h1 is the tag group for every h1 tag. So you'll see here I have 2 h1 tags, one over here and one down here. And with this h1 tag grouping, they're all the exact same. They'll all be modified the exact same way. And that is to have a color blue, a text color of blue. Justin asks, what happens if you set color to 2 different colors in different classes, but a div has both classes? That's where you have to be very careful, actually. It depends on the browser you're loading it with. Some browsers will load what came first. Some will load what came last as like the focus ones. Some will kind of like do something in between. I'm not 100% sure sometimes. But typically speaking, the last property that was loaded is the property that is saved. So you can like override properties by having them come later in the file or later in like your declaration statements. However, it's recommended if you can avoid it, please don't do that. Try to avoid having that happen if possible. I forgot my thought here. It'll come back to me. Yeah, there is a way to force, like, there is a way to force a certain color to come through, but it's not coming through, but it's not recommended. It's called an important statement. Don't do it. It's very bad coding. Yes, just back to this thing. Sorry. Yeah, classes. So again, the dot here and then the class name is how you do a class grouping. So I have a dot class example like this. And class example is a type of class that you see this element here and this element here has. And I have some stuff set up like our font size and font family. So remember, font size is in terms of px or pixels, not in terms of points like it is in like Word or like Google Docs. Because again, we're not making printed documents, we're making electronic text. So I want my font to be 18 pixels high or 18 pixels large. You may want to change this to be however large you want it to be for your code, obviously. And if you want to make your code scale with the web page, which is a bizarre thing to want to do, you can make it a percent instead. I want my code, my font to be 18% of the web page's size. Don't do that. I don't know why you would do that, but it could happen. So if you want to, that's how you would do it. About the pins here. And again, font family. So font family, we have two fonts here, Helvetica and then sans serif. Sorry. So again, the reason we have two, Helvetica is not always included on every computer. Most of them are going to have it nowadays, but some of them don't. And in case you don't have a Helvetica font installed, we want it to look somewhat normal. And so we use a backup font. The two fonts you can be guaranteed to work on every web browser is sans serif and serif, spelled S-E-R-I-F. If you don't know anything about fonts, sans serif is kind of like your Arial or your Calibri or something like that with no lines. It's very, very modern web looking. Serif is like your Times New Roman, more fancy, more like printed text looking. So it's always recommended to have at least one of those two as your last backup font in case none of your other fonts load properly. And then I saw a question, I get to the question at the end here. A second class called class 2, again, dot class name. The background color here is gray. And the last thing is this ID example, the hashtag for the ID. And then I have text align center, center will be text, and background color, make it yellow green. So someone asks, Minji asks, so demo3.html calls demo3.css and returns h1 class. Not exactly. This isn't really class-like you think of it like Java or like C++ or Python even. This is more of like on the idea that this file will look for elements with these properties and apply this style to them. If you want to see a little bit more why, you can do something called inline styling. So you don't actually always need to have CSS. You can put your code inline or inside the HTML file. However, it just makes it harder to read the HTML file. And so for that reason, we tend to put the style, the CSS properties in a separate file so that they're easier to see. So this just isn't returning anything. It's more like telling the browser, okay, whenever you find an H1 tag, change the color to blue. Or whenever you find an element with the div classes, the class name class example, not div, the class name class example, change its font size to this size, its font family to this. Cool, yeah. And one more interesting thing to note, you'll see when I run the demo. Any time you have, for example, a div tag here, any tag that's nested inside of a tag, a style, for example, this class tag here is the class example. These two P tags will follow the same formatting guidelines as the parent tag, in this case, class example. So both these P tags will also have a font size of 18 and the font family of Helvetica and sans serif. So that's why we use div tags also quite a bit, is to style a group of elements in one big shot. we can say, all right, everything on this page has to be styled one way. Instead of doing the same thing over and over and over, we can just say, all right, this entire div tag, style a class name, class equals whatever, style the class in one big shot. And so when we run this code, done with the HTML, you'll see it loads like we thought it would. So the H text, the H one, that big title text became blue, like we thought. They're both blue, you see that. The class example, the text is a bit bigger. It's 0.18, but it's a 18px font, and it's Helvetica. If you can kind of see this, the serif, the default serif font, you see the title and all the other text, versus the sans serif Helvetica font you see in this first class, you can see why font family is so powerful. Then we have that ID here. This text is being confirmed with ID type. You can see it's a weird green background. It has that center text align. And we also have this H tag, then blue, and on the bottom it's this class again. Now look very closely here. This class had two classes in it. It has class example and class 2. Like I said, remember how HTML elements can belong to multiple CSS groupings? This div has two classes, class example and class 2. Look at our CSS. That means that the CSS properties in both class example and the CSS properties in class 2 will be used. So if you look at our code, I'll zoom in a little bit to make it easier to see here. You can see that the font has become the font 18px and that Helvetica font, like it was in class example, and it also has that same background color as the class 2 CSS code gives. Sorry, Ayush asked, what's a class versus an ID? Yeah, very common problem. So again, a class can be, they're both same in that they represent a group of HTML elements, but just to hit on the nose, an ID can only represent a single parent tag. So for example, in my code, here, I cannot have another ID equals ID example. However, I can have multiple class equals class example or class 2s. So if you think about like an ID is like an ID number, it's unique to the person who it's assigned to. Whereas a class, like example, like a class at Purdue consists of multiple things, and there can be multiple people in a class. If that makes it any clearer. What if the classes have conflicting properties? Yeah, so if the classes have conflicting properties, like we talked about earlier, most browsers default to whatever was loaded last. So for example, if I have class example and class 2, I believe, I could be wrong about this. If I, for example, change the background color in class example, we'll say, I don't know, background color, we'll make it aqua. It should default to the last example, which is the gray here. But I'm not 100% sure, we'll find out. Yeah, it defaults to the gray because the gray came last. You want to call it last, I guess, in the declaration. So it's considered the most important of the properties to be given. However, again, this is very bad code. I'm going to show it to you guys. Do not do this in your actual code, please. I can say that it is important. Oh. Important. Please don't do this in your actual code. It's very bad habit to do so, but I'm going to show it to you. It's an example of what you could also do. If you say something that is important, it'll override any other changes. So it'll override this gray in the actual elements. If you go back and reload this page, it changes them both to the aqua because the aqua is forced to override everything. But do be in mind that doing this important is not good. It's considered bad practice. It's better to be more careful. It's better to be just make your classes more unique than if you need to make your colors different, for example. All right, are there any questions about the demo code here? About IDs or classes, because that can be a very big ship up for a lot of people. All right, I'm not seeing any, but if you can have them, put them inside of the the chat and I'll get to them whenever I have a chance. Where am I going now? Here. All right. Last little bit. Okay, checkpoint number 2. So the checkpoint number 2 we'll come back to after we'll go over some of the last little end of class stuff, but it is to create a basic to-do site using HTML and CSS. And this by really means just basically having a list of things you need to make to finish and like styling them, looking to make them look nice. And you'll see why we want to do this in a second. But first things first, other CSS resources. So like I said, there are a lot of properties and you will probably want to use a lot of the other ones. For example, like margin or padding. We only went over the extreme basics in this course here. I highly, highly, highly recommend you check out this link here to look at the other properties. You will definitely be using these other ones later on, but we can't cover them for time reasons right now. If you do want to learn more about them though, office hours are a great resource, or even Slack. Ask them on Slack and we'll make sure that people answer your question very, very quickly. So a project demo. So like I mentioned, our final project, in case you weren't familiar, is going to be a to-do like application where you can add, remove, edit to-dos, and you can also store them in a database. So I actually have one written. I'm not going to go through the code with you guys because I think that might be a little bit, one gets to package your own. We're going to load the sites. So here is kind of how the to site will look at the end of the project, I guess. It may not be exactly like this, but it'll be very similar. So you can see you can add to-dos, you can edit them, you can delete them, you can restore or delete the finished one, you can mark it as finished. So let's practice a little bit. So example, we'll I don't know, we'll add another one. Learn HTML and CSS. If we add it, it is added to our to-do list. I can mark the slides as done, so I'll mark them as done. I can delete the finish this website if I wanted to, because it's pretty much finished. I can edit this one. So I can teach VueJS, teach JavaScript. And we can save it, and it'll save, change the text and save it right there. And all of these changes are being saved to a database. So even if I refresh the page, so we'll close this page and we'll open it up again. You see they are actually all saved. So you can come back to it literally at a point in time and keep working your to-do lists. We will cover all of this, how to do is kind of an advanced feature set. Don't worry guys, in the next 3 or 4 lessons, your job is to just make something that looks like the shell here, like the idea of like the to-do app, like a bullet pointed list if you want to make it that way. Don't worry about the button, don't worry about the database stuff. That's all for like weeks 3, 4, 5. Just worry about making like a to-do app where you have a list of tasks and a list of finished tasks and make it look nice. All right, little bit more last minute stuff. It wants to load for me. Oh, there we go. All right, thank you guys for coming so much. I've asked that everyone, if you guys could take a few moments and fill out the feedback form you guys see on screen here. It's also again on the slides. What number is this? 30. If you want to get the link through Slack. If you have any questions, please come to open review hours on Thursdays, 6 p.m. to 7 p.m. Eastern, or ask in your breakout rooms or on Slack. And again, this feedback form is anonymous, so if you have some complaints, please let us know. We do read them. We try to figure out what we can do better for next time, or keep doing for next time as well. And we really do love the feedback quite a bit. So with that in mind, I believe that we have finished all of our stuff for today. We're going to move into breakout rooms to ask about some CSS stuff in more particulars. And if you have any questions, again, ask your mentors or even put them in your the chat in Slack as well. So let me start.